Solomon was not just a name carved into sacred genealogies. He was an anomaly in time, a king whose fame crossed borders and who seemed to have won the power game before the other kings even understood the rules. His throne not only symbolized authority, but a rare fusion of strategic intelligence, spiritual dominance, and extreme accumulation of resources. Under his rule, Israel experienced a period of unprecedented stability, while becoming a protagonist in a complex web of international alliances, trade, and cultural influence. The city of Jerusalem, once a modest tribal center, was transformed into a showcase for gold, imported cedars, and monumental architectural designs. But behind the reports of almost divine wisdom, there were gears driven by risky political decisions, hidden treaties, and social structures that supported this brilliance with shadows. How righteously has this greatness been built? And where does exploration begin? The story of Solomon, told in school books or in Sunday liturgies, tends to erase layers that reveal much more than just a virtuous king. He was also an architect of power, who operated within a logic typical of the great empires of the ancient world. Concentration of wealth, administrative centralization, and use of religion as a political tool. The figure who built the temple in Jerusalem is the same one who maintained a system of heavy taxes and requested forced labor from neighboring, subjected peoples. The Bible does not hide this detail, but it often goes unnoticed. What was the true cost of Solomon's glory? How far was he able to go to sustain a government structure that claimed to be holy, but operated with gears very similar to those of the Egyptian, Assyrian, and Babylonian empires? If you are looking for interpretations that go beyond the surface and reveal the historical background behind the most enigmatic figures in the Bible, subscribe to the channel. Here, the story is investigated in depth, without devotional filters or easy simplifications. Understanding begins where common sense ends. He did not inherit peace. He built it with a network of skillfully crafted international agreements. Although his reign is remembered as a time of peace, the term is misleading. The absence of direct war does not mean the absence of conflict. Solomon participated in a diplomatic game of the highest level, in which marriage was a state tool, natural resources were geopolitical currency, and religion was the official language to consolidate alliances. He didn't just govern, he operated like a master of political engineering. It is at this point that the image of the wise king begins to clash with that of the man who coldly explored the gears of power, because along with fame came demands. To keep his kingdom functioning, Solomon divided the territory into administrative districts, each responsible for supporting the palace with supplies and tribute. It was an efficient but cumbersome collection system, and the biblical text itself suggests internal tensions. The people began to complain about the burden imposed by this king who, although fair in his judgments, did not hesitate to exploit the nation's human and material resources. If Solomon's wisdom was so great, why did he need so much structure, so much gold, so many alliances, and so much control? What does this reveal about the real functioning of his reign? These questions do not diminish its greatness, but they take the narrative off the pedestal of idealization and place it on the concrete terrain of history. And it is on this ground that we begin to discover the true face of a king who perhaps was closer to the great emperors of the world than to the saints of religious traditions. The gears that moved Solomon's empire were not just made of precious stones, agricultural tributes, or military alliances. It was also supported by people, mostly women, who were used as diplomatic pawns and status symbols. The king's famous harem, described with 700 wives and 300 concubines, was not just an Oriental exaggeration to enhance his grandeur. It was, above all, a carefully engineered political structure. Each woman who entered his palace represented a sealed alliance, a signed treaty, a purchased peace. They were foreign princesses, young women from influential families, or even captured from subordinate peoples. They didn't just live there, they made up a living diplomatic network. This practice was far from exclusive to Solomon. Empires such as the Egyptian and Hittite already used marriages as a means of signing international agreements. But in the case of Israel, whose faith was based on clear commandments against idolatry, And mixing with pagan cultures, the dimension of the Solomonic harem gained a delicate moral contour. Many of these women brought with them their own gods, rituals, and customs. The biblical text does not ignore this point. It states that, in old age, Solomon allowed his loves to lead him astray, erecting altars to foreign deities in their name. The wise king, the one who built the temple to the God of Israel, also opened space for worship of deities such as Ashtaroth, Moloch, and Chemosh, some even associated with practices such as human sacrifices. Behind the harem facade, there was not only desire or vanity, but also a functional mechanism of government. Keeping so many women meant maintaining a large court, dozens of servants, clothes, jewelry, private temples, and protocols. The cost was immense, and those who supported all of this were the same people who began to complain about the burdens imposed and the visible inequalities between palatial luxury and common life in the tribes of Israel. The figure of Solomon, therefore, cannot be read simply as that of the wise man who wrote Proverbs and judged fairly. He was also someone who structured a system of power where female bodies were currency, and where spirituality could be traded in exchange for political stability. Concubines and foreign wives also served as agents of cultural influence. The presence of so many identities within the palace means that Jerusalem was in constant contact with ideas, practices, and beliefs from across the Fertile Crescent. This brought undeniable cultural richness, but it also created an ambiguous environment regarding Israel's religious allegiance. It was not just the people who were influenced by neighboring cultures. It was the king himself who institutionally allowed this opening. And perhaps this leads us to an uncomfortable question. To what extent did Solomon serve God, and at what point did he begin to serve his own power? Glory, when it reaches a certain level, usually requires sacrifices, and they are not always voluntary. The story of these women, often treated only as numbers, bears the most human and forgotten traits of Solomonic politics. Because every empire, even the wisest, leaves trails of silence where voices were erased. If the Solomonic power structures were supported by alliances, tributes, and a political harem, there was still a less visible but equally determining component: the symbolic. Solomon understood that reigning was not just about controlling territories and resources, but also dominating narratives, myths, and archetypes. The king who judged between two women fighting over a baby did not just apply justice. He embodied divine wisdom itself, and it is precisely in this gray area between the historical and the legendary that reports emerge that go beyond conventional logic, bringing Solomon closer to an almost mythical figure, with powers that bordered on the supernatural. It is at this point that non-canonical texts begin to fill gaps left by the traditional biblical narrative. Among these texts, one of the most enigmatic is the Testament of Solomon, a manuscript attributed to the Hellenistic period, but which bears echoes of much older oral traditions. In it, Solomon is portrayed as someone who not only spoke to angels but also had authority over demons. According to the story, he received a magical ring from God, with which he could command spiritual beings and force them to perform tasks, including the construction of the temple in Jerusalem itself. This vision of a wizard and exorcist Solomon is radically different from the austere sage described in Proverbs, but is closer to a tradition that resonates behind the scenes in Jewish culture, and later in the Islamic tradition, and even in European esoteric literature. Solomon's ring, in this context, is not just an object of power. It is a symbol of dominion over the invisible forces that would govern the spiritual world. Demons like Asmodeus, for example, are mentioned as being subjugated by the king, forced to reveal their names, functions, and weaknesses in a kind of ancestral occult manual. Even though these accounts are not part of the biblical canon, they cannot simply be dismissed as fantasy. They reveal how, over the centuries, the figure of Solomon was given new meaning to meet the concerns of different cultures and times. The search for absolute knowledge, for control of the invisible, and for spiritual and material authority is a human constant. And in Solomon, these dimensions merged so intensely that he came to be seen as a bridge between the physical and metaphysical worlds. The Kabbalistic tradition itself, which emerged centuries later, draws from this construction. Solomon appears as the holder of secret knowledge, capable of manipulating the names of God and accessing spiritual realities closed to common men. He stops being just a king and starts to represent the archetype of the initiate, one who saw, understood, and governed that which is beyond human comprehension. This symbolic transformation reveals much more about the human mind than about the historical Solomon himself, but at the same time, it indicates how his image was shaped to be a mirror of our greatest ambitions. Because ultimately, the fascination with Solomon as master of spirits is not just mystical curiosity. It is an attempt to explain how a man could gather so much power without being challenged, how he could build so much without getting dirty with the mud of everyday conflicts, and perhaps this explanation would only be possible when the king stopped being just a man and began to inhabit the kingdom of symbols, where even demons recognize authority. Solomon's transition from earthly king to mystical figure not only expanded his influence on subsequent generations, it also created an intriguing paradox. The more his image was mythologized, the more difficult it became to recognize the man behind the legend. Biblical sources present him as the son of David and Bathsheba, legitimate heir to a consolidated throne. But some scholars raise the possibility that the figure of Solomon is, at least in part, a composite literary construction, the fusion of deeds attributed to several kings into a single character, idealized as a symbol of order, wisdom, and absolute power. This hypothesis, although uncomfortable for more traditional readings, does not diminish the impact of the narrative. On the contrary, it increases its complexity. Because if Solomon was, in part, a character constructed to represent the height of the Israelite monarchy, this reveals that the people themselves needed to create an ideal king that brought together wisdom, military power, administrative capacity, and spiritual access, an unattainable but desired model. The question that emerges is inevitable. Was this figure shaped to reflect a real man, or to project the needs and ambitions of a nation in search of identity? When looking at the contemporary world, it is not difficult to see echoes of this construction. Modern leaders, from technology moguls to charismatic political figures, are often treated as almost mythical entities. They are associated with a superior intelligence, with a worldview inaccessible to ordinary citizens, and their decisions are interpreted as manifestations of a rationality that transcends the present. The cult of personality is nothing new. It just changed its clothes. Where there were once thrones, there are now algorithms. Where there were magic rings, today there is control over data, networks, and invisible systems that define the course of entire societies. Solomon, in this sense, remains current. He represents the intersection of power, knowledge, and spiritual authority, a rare but seductive combination. He is the archetype of the leader who not only commands, but understands, anticipates, and sees what others do not see. And therefore, it also carries the risk of a silent fall. Because the higher the image built, the more blind you can become in the face of the real consequences of your actions. The biblical text itself ends his story with the bitter note of the division of the kingdom after his death. A trail of unresolved tensions, excessive tributes, and fragile alliances that collapsed as soon as his figure stopped supporting everything. But perhaps Solomon's most disturbing legacy is not in the riches he accumulated or the demons he controlled, but in the silent lesson that his story leaves. Power, however brilliant it may seem, has a cost, and that cost almost always is paid by those who do not appear in the records: nameless slaves, forced workers, foreign peoples absorbed by treaties, subjects subjected to taxes to support the ostentation of a throne that was said to be sacred. This is the other side of wisdom, the awareness that every empire has its price, and that the true greatness of a leader may not lie in how much he achieves, but in how much he manages to maintain integrity while exercising power. If this type of approach makes sense to you, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This helps a lot to keep this content alive here. And here's the invitation. The next video will continue to uncover forgotten layers of biblical history. I'll meet you there.